The night was heavy with the scent of smoke and fear. Across the lands of Eastern Europe, the whispers of a name traveled faster than the wind: Vlad Dracula. To some, he was a defender of Christendom, a ruler who dared to defy the might of an empire that had conquered half the known world. To others, he was a monster, a man whose cruelty blurred the line between legend and nightmare. But in the summer of 1462, as the Ottoman Empire unleashed the largest military force Europe had ever seen, this man, this prince, would turn terror itself into his greatest weapon. What unfolded was not merely a war, but a psychological masterpiece so haunting that even centuries later, it would echo in the chronicles of history. The year was 1462. Across the rolling hills of Wallachia, smoke rose from burning villages as the ground trembled beneath the march of the largest army the Ottoman Empire had ever assembled. At its head rode Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, a man whose very name struck terror into the heart of Christian Europe. His banners stretched beyond the horizon, a sea of crescent moons and shimmering silk that declared the power of an empire spanning 3 continents. Yet standing in his path was a single man, a prince whose cruelty was so legendary, whose methods so precise and unrelenting, that even the most hardened warriors spoke his name in whispers. This was Vlad III of Wallachia, Vlad the Impaler, and he was about to wage a campaign of psychological warfare so terrifying that it would drive the mighty Sultan himself to retreat. What took place in the summer of 1462 was not just a clash of armies. It was a masterclass in terror, a night assault so daring, so brilliantly orchestrated, that it shattered the morale of the most powerful military force in the world. This is the story of how one man's ruthless genius brought an empire to its knees, and why the tactics he used still echo through the chronicles of military history. To understand Vlad's audacity, one must first grasp the impossible odds he faced. The Ottoman war machine rolling toward his borders was unlike anything medieval Europe had ever seen. Sultan Mehmed boasted to his viziers that he commanded 150,000 men. The Greek historian Leonikos Chalkokondyles, who witnessed the march, described it as immense, second only to the army that had conquered Constantinople. Other chroniclers placed the number even higher, 250,000, perhaps even 300,000 soldiers under the crescent banner. This was not merely an army. It was an empire in motion. At its core were the dreaded janissaries, elite slave soldiers whose discipline and ferocity had crushed kingdoms. Surrounding them marched endless ranks of infantry, while the thunder of hooves heralded the Sipahi, Ottoman cavalry whose charges had broken Christian lines from Hungary to the gates of Vienna. Behind them came the Azaps and irregulars. Slaves offered a chance at freedom through bravery in battle, their desperation turning them into the most dangerous of fighters. The diversity of this host was overwhelming. Akinci raiders drew their bows beside Sebasai guards protecting the Sultan's flanks. Azaps wielded pikes, while Beslis handled the new firearms that were changing the nature of war itself. At the center of it all rode Mehmed's own bodyguards, warriors sworn to die before allowing harm to come to the man who had humbled Byzantium. But it wasn't just manpower that inspired terror. The Ottomans brought 120 cannons, their bronze throats ready to pulverize castle walls into dust. Engineers and laborers followed close behind, prepared to construct bridges and roads to carry this avalanche of steel deeper into Europe. Islamic priests attended to the army's faith, while astrologers charted the stars to guide the Sultan's hand. The logistics alone were staggering. Chalkokondyles recorded that Danube shipowners were paid 300,000 gold pieces just to ferry the army across the river. Behind the ranks trailed women meant for the soldiers' leisure and supply trains stretching for miles, carrying food, ammunition, and countless essentials to sustain this moving city of war. Against this overwhelming tide stood Vlad with barely 30,000 men. The imbalance was crushing, 5-1 in favor of the Ottomans, perhaps even worse. Any rational commander would have surrendered, accepted vassalage, or fled to the mountains to fight another day. But Vlad the Impaler was no ordinary commander. He had learned the ways of his enemies firsthand, lessons forged in hatred. Years earlier, as a young prince, Vlad had been held hostage at the Ottoman court alongside his brother Radu. While Radu thrived in captivity, converting to Islam and rising through Ottoman ranks, Vlad had stewed in resentment. He studied the Ottomans with cold precision, learning their language, customs, and weaknesses. And when the time came, he would turn that knowledge against them with surgical brutality. The war began when Vlad refused to pay the annual tribute demanded by the Sultan, 10,000 ducats and 500 recruits. When Ottoman envoys came to collect, Vlad sent them back with their turbans nailed to their heads. The message was unmistakable. Wallachia would not kneel. But Vlad didn't wait for Mehmed's response. In an act that stunned even his own men, he launched a preemptive strike across the Danube into Ottoman Bulgaria. The campaign that followed was nothing short of nightmarish. Village after village fell, and in each, Vlad left his grisly signature. Forests of stakes bearing the impaled bodies of Ottoman soldiers and civilians alike. In a letter to King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, Vlad recorded his work with chilling precision. 23,884 Turks slain, not counting those burned alive or beheaded. The numbers read like an accountant's ledger, but behind each figure was a calculated act of terror meant to echo all the way to the Sultan's ears. This was not just war. It was a statement, a declaration that fear itself could be weaponized. Mehmed's response was swift. He summoned an army even greater than the one that had taken Constantinople. When this campaign ended, he vowed, Wallachia would cease to exist, and Vlad's head would hang from the gates of Adrianople. As the great Ottoman host advanced north, few could have imagined what awaited them. Vlad, their former hostage, had prepared his land like a trap. He understood that he could never defeat such a force in open battle, but he could destroy its will to fight. The Ottomans crossed the Danube like a swarm of locusts. Their ships darkened the waters. Their banners turned day into shadow. Yet as they marched deeper into Wallachia, they found nothing. No defenders. No villages bustling with life. No spoils of war. Vlad had emptied the land itself. Wells were poisoned with the carcasses of animals. Granaries were torched. Crops were burned. Entire towns vanished, their people driven into the mountains. The invaders advanced through a wasteland designed to starve them, dehydrate them, and break their spirit. Even the terrain had turned against them. Rivers were diverted into treacherous marshes. Roads were torn up, replaced with deadly pits disguised with branches. Horses broke their legs. Men fell and never rose again. The psychological toll was immense. Chronicler Tursun Beg wrote that soldiers marched for days without finding a single drop of clean water. The summer sun roasted them alive, their armor so hot they joked they could cook meat upon it, until the joke stopped. What began as a confident invasion turned into a nightmare. Every step forward led deeper into a ghostly realm shaped by the mind of a madman. And this was only the beginning of Vlad the Impaler's war. For 7 relentless days, Sultan Mehmed's grand army pressed deeper into Wallachia, only to find nothing, no food, no water, no trace of man or beast. The conqueror of Constantinople, the master of the greatest city in the world, now led an army starving in a land turned to dust and shadow. The soldiers, once accustomed to the spoils of Ottoman triumph, marched through empty villages and drank from poison wells. Morale began to fracture like ice beneath the thawing sun. But Vlad was far from finished. From the forested hills and misted valleys, Wallachian cavalry struck with terrifying precision. They were ghosts on horseback appearing without warning, cutting down supply trains and isolated patrols, then vanishing into the darkness before the Ottomans could even react. There were no great battles, only sudden storms of violence designed to shatter nerves and sow despair. Ottoman sentries flinched at every sound beyond the firelight, every whisper of wind through the trees. Sleep became a luxury few dared to indulge in. Vlad knew his enemy well. Years of captivity among the Ottomans had taught him how their war machine operated, how it relied on discipline, speed, and supply. Break those pillars, replace them with fear and exhaustion, and even an empire could bleed. Each raid was carefully calculated not for the number of dead it left behind, but for the panic it spread through the ranks. Soldiers began to murmur of devils in the forests, of a prince who commanded shadows. Yet this was only the prelude. As the Ottoman host trudged toward Targovist, Vlad prepared his masterpiece, a single strike that would embody his ruthless genius. For that, he needed knowledge, precise intelligence of the Ottoman camp, and he would obtain it himself. On the night of June 16th, as weary guards stared into the void beyond their fires, a lone man in Turkish garb approached the camp. He spoke perfect Ottoman Turkish, his accent flawless. To the sentries, he was just another messenger or guide. In truth, it was Vlad himself, walking calmly into the heart of an army that would have torn him apart if they had known who he was. His disguise was impeccable, crafted through years of observation. He had lived among these men, learned their customs, their commands, their gestures. Now he used that knowledge to move unnoticed through their ranks. He studied everything: the Sultan's great pavilion marked by its banners, the placement of the janissaries, the cavalry lines, the officers' meeting tents. Every detail burned into his mind. The Ottomans, confident in their strength, had grown lax. That arrogance would cost them dearly. Vlad also listened. He heard soldiers grumble about the endless march. Officers complain of fruitless victories. Men cursed the cursed land they trudged through. And then came the revelation that would shape his plan. Sultan Mehmed had forbidden his troops from leaving their tents at night to prevent confusion during surprise attacks. Vlad realized instantly that this precaution would become their undoing. When his assault came, they would be trapped in their own tents, paralyzed by fear, unable to rally, their discipline dissolving in chaos. By the time he slipped back into the night, no one suspected the phantom who had walked among them. No alarm was raised, no pursuit followed. The Ottoman guards had unknowingly let the architect of their doom pass freely through their midst. Back in the hills, Vlad convened his most trusted captains and revealed his plan. It sounded impossible an attack on the enemy camp itself. But his warriors, hardened men who had seen him turn madness into victory, did not hesitate. They would follow him into the jaws of death if he commanded it. Vlad handpicked 7,000 to 10,000 of his finest cavalry silent riders who had survived countless clashes along the Danube. As dusk fell on June 16th, they prepared for what might be their final ride. Swords were sharpened to gleaming edges, armor inspected in silence, horses fed and watered. Every strap, every buckle was checked and rechecked. There would be no second chances. Vlad moved among them, calm and resolute. His presence burned with quiet authority. To his men, he was not merely a prince, but an omen, a man who had defied empires and lived to tell the tale. When he spoke of storming the Ottoman camp, there was no bravado in his tone, only certainty. His plan was brutally simple. Using the knowledge gained from his infiltration, he would ride straight to the main gate, disguised once more, and command the guards to open it in flawless Turkish. Once inside, his cavalry would split, some spreading terror throughout the camp, others driving straight for Mehmed's pavilion. The timing had to be perfect, the darkest hour before dawn, when human vigilance was at its lowest. As the moonless night deepened, the Wallachian riders descended from the hills. Hooves were wrapped in cloth, weapons muted, orders passed by gesture alone. They moved like shadows across the fields, their approach hidden by the sleeping earth. The Ottoman camp stretched before them like a sprawling city of canvas, its campfires flickering like stars scattered across the plain. Within that maze lay their target, and Vlad led his men forward with the confidence of a man who had already walked those paths. At the gate, the final act of audacity unfolded. Vlad rode ahead alone, his voice calm and clear as he called out in perfect Turkish. The drowsy guards, suspecting nothing, obeyed his command. The gates swung open, and in that moment, the fate of the Ottoman army was sealed. The Wallachian cavalry surged through the breach like a living storm, a black tide of horsemen crashing into the heart of the Ottoman camp. For a brief moment, there was only the sound of pounding hooves and the hiss of cold air, but then, all at once, silence broke into chaos. Torches burst to life, casting jagged shadows across the sprawling encampment, illuminating a nightmare in motion. Horses reared and screamed as Wallachian riders carved through tent ropes, sending silken canopies collapsing over confused soldiers. Supply wagons splintered under the crush of hooves. Camels, wild with terror, tore through the camp, trampling men and scattering equipment in every direction while their handlers shouted desperately to regain control. The confusion was made worse by the very rules Sultan Mehmed had put in place to maintain nighttime. Disciplined Ottoman soldiers were forbidden to leave their tents after dark. Now those same tents became death traps, flimsy prisons that collapsed upon the men inside as the cavalry thundered past. Those who managed to escape into the night found themselves blinded by darkness, their nerves shattered. They slashed at anything that moved, unable to tell friend from foe, killing their own comrades in the madness. At the center of this storm rode Vlad III himself, the Prince of Wallachia, grim, relentless, and utterly fearless. His personal guard followed close behind, their black armor glinting in the firelight like the wings of ravens. Vlad's sword flashed again and again, its arc catching the torchlight as he cut down every soldier foolish enough to stand in his path. His voice rose above the din, commanding his men with the authority of a man possessed by divine vengeance. Behind him, his cavalry spread like wildfire, their battle cries echoing through the smoke-filled air, each shout carrying terror deeper into the Ottoman ranks. For those few hours, they were no longer the outnumbered defenders of a small, defiant principality. They were the masters of the battlefield. Through sheer will and audacity, they transformed themselves into something larger than life, almost mythical in their fury. The Ottoman response unfolded exactly as Vlad had planned. Panic rippled through the camp like a plague. Regiments turned their weapons on one another, convinced that infiltrators had disguised themselves among their ranks. Officers shouted conflicting orders as discipline disintegrated. The organization and precision that had long defined Ottoman military supremacy vanished in the chaos. The sounds of battle erupted from every direction at once, swords clashing, horses screaming, men shouting in terror, creating the illusion that the camp was under attack by tens of thousands, rather than a few thousand Wallachian horsemen. The night became an endless circle of confusion and fear. For 3 long hours from midnight until the first hint of dawn, the carnage continued. Vlad's horsemen struck and vanished, reappearing like ghosts in another sector of the camp before the Ottomans could regroup. Wagons burned, supply lines were shredded, and the grand Ottoman camp, once a symbol of imperial power, was reduced to a landscape of fire and ruin. Yet despite all this destruction, the ultimate objective slipped from Vlad's grasp. When his riders finally reached the Sultan's pavilion, they found it abandoned. Mehmed, warned just in time by his guards, had been spirited away to safety moments before the Wallachians arrived. The golden chance to end the war with a single stroke to kill or capture the most powerful ruler in the known world had vanished like smoke on the wind. As dawn broke across the smoldering battlefield, Vlad faced the hardest decision a commander can make. The raid had achieved everything except its most crucial goal, and to linger any longer would mean annihilation. With cold precision, he ordered the retreat. The Wallachian cavalry vanished into the morning mist as swiftly as they had come, leaving behind devastation that would burn itself into Ottoman memory for generations. The aftermath of the assault was staggering. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers lay dead, though even the survivors could not say how many had fallen to Wallachian blades or to the desperate confusion of their own comrades. Horses and camels wandered aimlessly through the wreckage, their riders long gone. Wagons smoldered, tents lay shredded, and the once organized camp was nothing more than a graveyard of splintered wood and torn silk. The ground itself was slick with blood, But the true damage ran far deeper than the physical destruction. The psychological wound struck to the heart of the empire's pride. These were men bred to victory soldiers of an empire that had conquered half the known world, who had breached the walls of Constantinople and believed themselves unstoppable. To see their invincible army brought to its knees by what appeared to be a small band of barbaric horsemen shattered something far greater than their formation. It shattered their faith. Even Sultan Mehmed II, the mighty conqueror of Constantinople, was shaken to his core. For the first time in his career, he had been forced to flee not from a great army, but from a man he had once dismissed as a petty prince. The humiliation was immense. The conqueror of cities had run for his life through the night, and word of that flight would soon spread across his empire like wildfire. Rumors multiplied, each version darker than the last, eroding the aura of invincibility that had always surrounded his name. His soldiers, once fearless, began to question whether divine favor still guided their banners. The fear that Vlad had sown that night would prove far more potent than any sword. But for Vlad, the night attack was only the beginning. The raid had been designed to wound, not to kill, to strike at the mind before striking at the body. As Mehmed's army regrouped and limped toward the Wallachian capital weeks later, they were met by a sight that no human mind could easily endure. Rising before them was a forest of 20,000 wooden stakes. Each stake bore the impaled body of an Ottoman prisoner, officers, soldiers, servants, all displayed in horrific symmetry. At the very center stood the towering corpse of Hamza Pasha, a high-ranking commander who had been captured earlier in the campaign. His body was raised higher than all the others, a grotesque monument to his former authority. The wind carried the stench of death for miles, and the buzzing of flies filled the air like a funeral dirge. The Greek chronicler Linikos Chalkokondyles would later write that Mehmed himself was struck speechless by the sight, his iron will faltering for the first time. The Sultan, who had once gazed upon the ruins of Constantinople with pride, now stared upon the handiwork of his enemy with awe and horror. "It is impossible," he is said to have murmured, "to deprive of his country a man who has done such great deeds." Even the conqueror of Constantinople recognized the genius, dark, terrible, but genius nonetheless of his adversary. Vlad had not simply fought a war of swords and steel. He had waged war upon the soul. Within days, the once mighty Ottoman army began its retreat. The force that had crossed the Danube in triumph now crossed it again in disgrace, their banners tattered, their spirits broken. The night attack at Targovist had lasted mere hours, but its impact would echo across centuries. Vlad the Impaler had demonstrated that victory did not always belong to those with the greatest armies, but to those who dared to wage war in ways their enemies could not comprehend. His 7,000 cavalry had not destroyed the Ottoman Empire, but they had destroyed its illusion of invulnerability. Vlad's genius lay not in brute strength, but in understanding the power of fear. Vastly outnumbered and facing certain destruction in open battle, he turned his weakness into his greatest weapon. Every element of his campaign, scorched earth, ambush, impalement, was designed not only to kill, but to unmake the enemy's will to fight. He transformed warfare into theater and terror into strategy. Modern historians would later call it asymmetric warfare, but in the 15th century, it was something far beyond comprehension. When Mehmed finally returned to his capital, he carried with him not the trophies of victory, but the heavy burden of defeat. His legend, once unassailable, was now stained by fear. He had learned a truth that few rulers ever admit, that the most dangerous enemy is not the one with the largest army, but the one willing to fight without boundaries. Vlad's name would echo through history, whispered with both horror and respect. For in that dreadful summer of 1462, the Prince of Wallachia had proven that sometimes the greatest victories are not won through numbers or might, but through the sheer, unbreakable will of a man who refuses to bow. His story endures as a testament to human cunning and resilience, a reminder that in the darkest hours of history, when hope seems lost and defeat inevitable, one man's will can reshape the fate of empires. Vlad the Impaler did not merely defend his homeland. He redefined the meaning of warfare itself, showing that even the smallest nation can defy a giant when guided by a mind both brilliant and merciless.